If I had more time, I would talk a little bit about the economics of preparedness for the storm, or more honestly, the lack thereof. If you watched television, well, let me back up. If your television worked and you watched it during this storm, you would have seen our mayor and our governor grabbing as much time as they could in front of the camera to tell us basically two things. One, that this was the worst storm that the world had ever seen, and number two, that some of the quote-unquote first responders were genuine heroes. I have nothing to say about that. I'm sure there were some genuine heroes, and it seemed to have been a bad storm. What the purpose of them telling us this, which we already knew, was to avoid having to face the problem that they should have been confronted with, which was, why in the world, after 10 years of untold billions of dollars in homeland security designed to prepare us to deal with crises like this, was their response so horrible and inadequate? It is really stunning. I will mention only 2 or 3 things. I'm sure you all have many stories. After several days in lower Manhattan of complete darkness and no power and no heat and so forth, people's cell phones were running out of juice, and they therefore couldn't even communicate that way in those areas that had not already lost that capacity anyway. So the Google Corporation, and I'm not eager to give them good publicity, but the Google Corporation managed, it has no responsibility to do this, to get a bunch of trucks and move them around lower Manhattan where citizens could come without a charge and get more power into their cell phones, so at least they could communicate with the world. The city of New York and the state of New York never occurred to them to do such a thing. Just like there were no trucks to come in with water, no trucks to come in with food, either ever or for long periods of time. They hadn't prepared what it might mean if you didn't have power, that people who live on the 47th floor of something would now have a new problem, which would be severe if they had medical needs or food needs. It's stunning. It's just a stunning declaration. They couldn't even figure out how to manage traffic in and out of the city. They hadn't worked out that maybe, I don't know, every odd-numbered avenue would be not available to the public, but only for emergency vehicles and loaded buses so people could get. That was a new idea that occurred several days into the storm, as was the sudden rule for a while that if you didn't have 3 passengers, you couldn't move from Manhattan to Brooklyn through any of the traffic. A stunning display. One has to wonder what it means. And as a hint to the answer, what it means, in many societies, including in modern times, one of the things that takes a society that is already dysfunctional, but is hobbling along, but takes it over the edge when it becomes no longer tolerable to people because it galvanizes their experience of a dysfunctional society, that's often a quote-unquote natural disaster. And suddenly it reveals the dysfunction. The Chernobyl accident in the Soviet Union was a crucial part of the end of that society because of the incompetence, the lying, and everything else that was done by officialdom in the Soviet Union to disguise or hide from the population how dangerous all of this was. This incompetence of the entire apparatus of our civilian government in the face of a storm that they had at least several days warning and should have had plans for suggests something and made an awful lot of people angry. Nor is it lost on many New Yorkers that one of the most successful movements to help people was the Occupy Sandy movement. The one that the mayor threw them out of the park and they were quiet for a while, but when they came back, it was to do for the city what the city government that threw them out of the park couldn't do. That's not lost on people. A lot of people figure that out. And that will percolate and have a lot to do with how people process what's going on in this society. Okay, I'm going to do this evening 2 or 3 smaller items that have happened in the last month that I think are worth our attending to, since this is a monthly economic update. And then I want to talk about the larger issue that is occupying everybody's attention and will for the next several weeks, maybe months, usually referred to these days as the fiscal cliff, and all of these decisions that are being made in Washington every day now that will end up affecting the taxes you all pay, the benefits from the federal government that you all get or depend on, and even if you don't, members of your family surely do. And that will affect you, therefore, in a very direct way. So let me begin. First, I want you to think about, if you haven't already, and I'm sure some of you have, about some of the implications of things that were said in the presidential campaign and afterwards. The 2 that I have in mind are the remark by Mitt Romney about the 47% of the people he can't reach, if you remember, during the campaign, because they are permanent Democratic voters, because they get benefits or they're dependent on the government, the words to that effect. The second is actually 3 of this. Second thing is shortly after the election when he said something about the Democratic Party won the election, or Obama did, because of the gifts, he used the word gifts, that the Democrats give to the people who vote for them. And the third item was an article written by, I believe, his campaign chairman or one of his key advisors, who did a empirical study and who discovered that Obama got a bigger majority among people who earn $50,000 or less than the majority Romney got from people who earn $50,000 or more. In other words, Romney won all the people who got 50 or more. Obama won all those who got less. But because Obama's margin was bigger, he prevailed. Message: poor people made it possible for Mr. Obama to win. I'm not interested in disputing the statistics. There's 800 studies out there. But here's what I want you to think about. First, let's put aside, because I'm going to talk about it in a minute, the question of who gets the most gifts from the government. Since that, well, you'll see in a minute that that's a very thorny matter. And Mr. Romney's representation is silly. But it is an extremely important one, because its accuracy is not what's important about it. We'll deal with that in a few minutes. I want you to think about what is being said here. Mr. Romney and his chief advisors, and indeed many in the Republican Party, and for that matter, beyond it, believe what he said there. And let me put it in a slightly different set of words. The United States is now divided into 2 communities. This is what this is saying. One community is people who work hard, are self-reliant, pay all the taxes, and are successful human beings. Another part of this country are people who do not work hard, who are lazy, shiftless, and all the other words that go with it, who can't be self-reliant, there's no self there, and who have crappy jobs and crappy lives and are bitter at everybody and solve the problems of life by leeching off the government. The first community pays the taxes to enable the second community to survive. And therefore, all of us, Romney, all of us Republicans or putative Republican voters need to protect ourselves from the claims upon us that are killing us for no better reason than to help the shiftless, lazy, incompetent, poor people that are on our backs. The reason that's important, besides understanding the power, Mr. Romney got 40, whatever it was, 7% of the people to vote for him, is it's a mark of that part of our society, the ones saying this, that they're no longer willing to say the story about how we're all Americans, how we're all together, how they represent what we all need and want, and so we should vote for them. They are really not doing that in a very important way. Their premise and what they say and feel comfortable saying is we're not all together. We're of two types here. Two types. And I, Romney, want to protect you who see this from them who threaten this. Another language for this, this is class war. It's setting up the argument of class in terms of rich and poor and hardworking and not. It says the country is now engaged in a war, and it's a call to arms of one side to protect itself by voting for Mr. Romney from the predation of the other part. It is very interesting when those people who had such an interest in not confronting a divided, fighting society now build their political arguments and hopes on driving that point home. And I really think it is something to learn from this election that you might not have thought about before. So let me turn immediately to one of the topics I want to go over with you, which is this question of who is dependent on the government. Clearly, Mr. Romney had in mind people who get Social Security, people who get food stamps, people who get all kinds of welfare supports, people who get rent subsidies. There's a whole host of these social welfare programs. And indeed, they are big in the United States. That's usually a reflection of the fact that our economy is not providing enough for large numbers of people, so the government adds to it. But any notion that the gifting of the government, federal, state, and local, is primarily that sort of thing is at best ignorant and naive, and at worst evil intended. And nothing could make this point clearer than a couple of stories that appeared in the New York Times, I believe, at the end of last week or at the beginning of this week. And if you haven't seen them, I did copy one of them here for you, if you're interested later. This one was carried on December 1st, so I guess Saturday. Headline, as companies seek tax deals, governments pay high price. That's the title in the New York Times. And this is nothing new about it. I'm going to tell you in a minute what's in the article, but I want you to see it as something that has been going on in the United States for its entire history. This story is about, starts off with a particular focus of attention on the state of Michigan and the corporation General Motors. Over the years, for a long time, General Motors has done what many other corporations do as a matter of course. I'm going to talk about General Motors because it was in this story, and so the facts are here for you to pursue if you're interested. And I don't mean to pick on General Motors. Indeed, I enjoy it, but I don't mean to pick on General Motors because many other companies would fit the bill for what I'm about to say. Here's the way this works. And if this sounds like a scam to you, good. So it begins this way. Hello, I'm on the phone. I am the local executive CEO of the General Motors subsidiary, whatever. I'm calling you Mr. Mayor of Ypsilanti, Michigan, which is an actual case, so I'm going to mention it. Ypsilanti, Michigan, and I'm telling you terrible bad news, but we're thinking that we're going to have to close the General Motors plant here in Ypsilanti that employs 642 people, or whatever it is, because, and then whatever the reasons are, the mayor has stopped listening because the mayor is confronting the end of his career. Why? It's America. So if a company leaves Ypsilanti, all the people in Ypsilanti have been trained throughout their lives to blame the mayor, who had absolutely zippity-doo to do with this decision. But that's the way we work as a nation. So all the local politicians understand if the jobs leave, they will get blamed. Everybody knows this. So the mayor knows that the purpose of the call is not to inform him. The purpose of the call is to give him a little time to come up with enough money to change the decision. And how would they do that? A tax holiday. You don't have to pay taxes for the next 6 years. Or a special program to allow people in the local jail for 18 cents an hour to work at the local GM plant. Oh, I didn't make any of this up. Or to build a new parking place for the factory at city expense on the grounds of whatever it is, to facilitate their handling a larger number. Whatever it is that is necessary will be negotiated. The city is facing what? The city is facing a threat. There's nothing complicated about this. And the mayor is facing a threat. The city will lose X jobs. Is this a bluff? There's no way to know. The only way you'd know whether the company was bluffing is if you could get access to the genuine books and records of the General Motors Corporation to see, which they are not required to give anybody, and they're certainly not going to give it to you. So you're not going to know. You want to call the bluff? Okay, says General Motors. We'll leave. We say we'll leave. Do you want to be in the position of having us leave? And making sure that as we leave, we will have a press conference in which we say, we called the mayor. We told him all about it. We did that months ago. We wanted to negotiate. Nah. Well, his career was in the toilet to begin with. Now it was flushing. He can't. He can't do it. So what does he do? He comes up with the money. He builds the parking lot. He redirects the road. He does an environmental study to make sure they don't get into trouble because they're using this chemical. Or he gives them a tax holiday, or he gives them a grant. Or he goes to the governor to get the governor to give state money to help the city. He does all those things because his career and the life of his community depend on it. And so they come up with the money. If you want the details, General Motors, just to give you an idea, the numbers here. Times investigation examined and tallied thousands of local incentives granted nationwide and has found that states, counties, and cities are giving up, ready, more than $80 billion a year to corporations to do something which, for all they know, they would have done anyway without the money, just to avoid calling the bluff. Okay, any serious calculation of who gets gifts from the government would have to include all the corporations that get those gifts. And for every gift that a New York Times reporter finds, I guarantee you there are a dozen he will not find, because no one lists it this way. I worked for many years in the city of New Haven, Connecticut, where I lived. This was an annual circus. All the companies that wanted to came in for their benefits. It was called in the city of New Haven urban renewal for a while. Then it was called redevelopment. Wonderful words. You need sociologists and English professors, but there are plenty of them, so they provide the words. And you can call this whatever you like. A yellow pomegranate would be nice. What it is, though, is a simple scam. We're coming in and we're telling you we may have to leave. We may have to close the factory. We may have to move the factory, or the office, or the store, or whatever it is. But of course, if you help us out here a little bit, we won't have to. And then we'll have a press conference with you, Mr. or Mrs. Mayor, where we will say to the local press how grateful we are for the leadership shown by the mayor in giving us $18 million, and now we can stay here. Isn't it wonderful? And everybody applauds. Bottom line, the money used to give these payoffs to these companies is money that's not available for anything else, to maintain the roads, the schools, all the rest of what a city government does. And in the end, the city government will have to go to the people to raise the taxes to make up for the money used to give these gifts to the corporate part of this society. Mr. Romney forgot about that. Even though his father's company in Michigan, American Motors, was a major beneficiary all of his young life. But politics gives you a short memory. It's a major problem in the United States and has been. And we're talking about huge amounts of money. So anyone who thinks this is small doesn't understand the scope of this and the fact that this is $80 billion a year, right? Think about that. That is an enormous amount of money that they've found, let alone all of the examples that they can't find because no records are kept that way.
80 billion in Michigan?
What?
80 billion in Michigan?
No, I think this is their estimate of the annual for the whole country. But they do give numbers about Michigan, and they give example after example, even some photographs of empty factories in Michigan, General Motors factories, and they point out, because they've done that research, this town gave General Motors $26 million. General Motors said, now we can stay here 2 years later because there's no binding here. These agreements never have a condition on them. I never saw that. Maybe there is an example somewhere in the United States, but mostly there are no conditions. The city gives it and hopes. But there's nothing to prevent the company a year or two later from having a new problem that they have to leave. That way they got 2 years of wonderful subsidy before they left. And you'd be, of course, very naive to imagine that the planners for the company don't understand this game really well. And when they figure out that they need to leave in 2 years, one of the first things you do is you have a press conference. You talk about how you need to leave because that'll make your last 2 years a lot more comfortable, profit-wise, than it would have been if you didn't play this game. And the way American politics is set up, it's like a gift to the corporations. It would be crazy for any company, anywhere, located in any city or town, not to go to the mayor and the governor and say, why not? You got nothing to lose and everything to win. So playing the cities and the states against each other, telling the governor of wherever you are that you're thinking of going to the governor where you're maybe going to go, let them bid, which is what they do. I went with officials of various cities at various times in my life to what are called presentation meetings, where a company that either was thinking of coming to where I was or thinking of leaving from where I was literally waiting for us as officials of the city to come in and persuade them not to leave or to come. And they would tell us, there was no one was hiding anything. We're here today, and we'll see how good the offer is you make us. And next week we're going to Iowa, and next week we're going to California, or we're going to ask them the same question, and we're going to go wherever we get the best deal. That's a part of the structure of gifting from the government. Number two, I don't have the time. The government is the largest single purchaser of everything in the United States. The government buys, for many, many companies, the government is a crucial buyer. Not only does the government buy what they produce, but the government negotiates with them over the price of what the government will pay. And you all remember, or if you don't, let me remind you that there are periodic scandals when it is discovered that, plastic toilet seats are sold to the Pentagon for $480 each, or fountain pens that you can pick up at your local bank for nothing, or retailing at $18 a pop to the Defense Department, or whatever it is. So many companies get wonderful, how shall I put it, gifts in the nature of these contracts. And the prices that are stipulated, the quantities that are stipulated, the terms of the deals. So gifts is what the government is all about. But the notion that they only go to poor people or working people or old people or sick people, that's part of the larger political, ideological breaking down of this society that I talked about before. Another example of it is the following. Under the health care bill that was fought over the last couple years, and that this summer the Supreme Court declared to be constitutional, there is a provision for Medicaid. Medicaid is the government program to provide medical insurance for poor people, not to be confused with Medicare, which is a program for older people to get medical insurance. So Medicaid is for people who are too poor to qualify or to afford insurance. Under that bill, the government wants to raise the eligibility for people. In other words, to get Medicaid, you used to have to earn the poverty level of income or less. Poverty level of income in this country is very low. So the new bill says you qualify if you get roughly 1 1/3 of the income poverty level. In other words, you can go as high as 135% of the poverty level rather than just 100%. So it helps what we call in statistics the near poor to get some medical insurance. In order to make this work, the federal government in the bill says that every state that agrees to sign up, because the state has the right to agree or not to participate. And please bear with me to understand, it means that the governor or the legislature of a state can decide whether or not millions of poor people in that state do or do not qualify for health insurance under the Medicaid program. So to sweeten it, the federal law says for the first 3 years, if you go along with it, every one of you 50 states, the federal government will pay 100% of the cost. You will have no cost. We will cover, as a federal expense, the insuring of all the new people that are eligible, those who earn between 100 and 133% of the poverty level. And after the third year, which the federal government pays everything, after the third year, the federal government will pick up 90% of the cost indefinitely. So for each state to cover millions of poor people with medical insurance would only cost the state 10% after the first 3 years. 16 states have so far indicated they're not going to do it. And when asked why, they said, we have to be fiscally prudent. And so the extra 10% of the increase of coverage that comes after the third year is more than they want to undertake. It's even doubly more interesting because if you know the way the law works, the law allows them to participate for the first 3 years, and at the end of the third year they can pull out, which means it would have cost them nothing. They're not even willing to do that. What is that about? That is about what I said at the beginning, what Mr. Romney's statements reflect. This is a breaking down of a society into those who are learning how to see the rest of the community as either we or them. And the them are not worth helping, not worth taking care of their health, not worth contributing even the smallest sum, because they're not just needy. They are sloppy, lazy, unself-reliant, wastrel. Get the picture? Most extreme example that I've seen. In Spain, which is having a terrible time, the unemployment rate 25%, the austerity there terrible. The parliament recently voted for an austerity program, much worse than here, cutting the health insurance for people to a huge extent, cutting support for schooling, and the right wing of the governing party, when this was announced, and the vote was a close vote, but they voted for the austerity. The right wing of the party, all the deputies in the Spanish parliament stood up and with great enthusiasm applauded. And you had the spectacle on European television of a smashing defeat that is going to kill large numbers of people and condemn them to medical problems for the rest of their lives with no recourse. They were applauding and cheering. They are what's left of Spanish Franco-fascism. For them, this was finally giving the just deserts, as many of them said, to the lazy, incompetent leeches that are dragging Spain down by their failure to work, by their inhuman dependency on the government. Same logic, but it is a polarization that it would be very unwise not to pay attention to. Okay, let's turn then to two things that I want to spend a little time with you on, partly because everybody is talking about them, but the understanding of them is limited. I'm going to be real polite here, okay? And I want to help overcome those limits. So the two things I want to talk about first are bailouts. What exactly is that we have been doing and continue to do? And then even more important, austerity, or the fiscal cliff. What exactly is going on here? So first, let's do bailouts. Bailouts is when the government or an agency of the government does a set of things to help mostly, not only, but mostly banks and other institutions that lend money. So let's look at that and how it worked, both here in the United States, but in many European, Asian, and other countries, where more or less the same thing happened, usually the difference only a difference of degree and not of kind. Okay, so let's begin. First issue. We have become an economy based on debt. It's more developed in the United States than in many other countries, but everyone is moving in that direction wherever you are in the world. The reliance on debt, much greater than it ever was before. What do I mean? Well, let me give the examples that are most comfortable in your own experience. When I was a younger person, whenever I went to a gas station or a supermarket and bought gas or bought my groceries, I had to pay in cash. The idea that I could hand a credit card was unthinkable. Even when you could use a credit card in, say, a department store or an appliance store, a grocery, for whatever reason, supermarket, didn't do it. And the idea of going to your local neighborhood stationery store or bodega and getting a bottle of water and handing them plastic, people would have thought that's ridiculous. I mean, that's craziness. You pay in cash. Well, you all know now everything is purchasable with credit card. Everybody, a credit card is a debt. When you use a credit card, the bank is actually giving you a loan and immediately moving that money into the hands of the merchant to pay for whatever you're buying with a credit card. That's what it is. So it's a loan, it's a debt. And you will get a notice at the end of the month, in case you haven't gotten one yet, you will, telling you you owe the bank all the money that you borrowed from them to make all those purchases. Corporations rely on debt more than they ever did before, and governments rely on debt more than they ever did before. So every player in the economy relies on debt. College students, up until recently, didn't have anything like the mountains of debt they now have to get a college education. So wherever you turn, more and more debt. Why is this important? Nothing in our economy can happen if there isn't a movement of money to pay the debts, to pay interest on the debts, to repay the debts, moving money to incur a debt. Okay? So debts are everywhere. Who is the crucial player in a world of debt? Banks. Because banks are the institution that make most of the loans in our society. So banks are institutions, and again, for those of you who haven't figured this out yet, I'm glad to be the one to explain it to you. Banks bring money into themselves for which they don't pay much, and then they lend it out at fees which are larger than what they paid to get it. That's why banks are rich. They pay you for your money a little, and then they lend it, often back to you, for a lot more. And you're grateful for the credit card. They're grateful that you're grateful, because that's how their income is made. And that's why the bank looks the way it does. In the middle of the town or village you come from, the bank is the largest building, the nicest building, made out of marble, and looks like a temple, which it is the modern equivalent of. Okay, so that's what we have. So banks, how do they get their money? Basically two ways, very simple. Deposits. That's when we put our money in there, our checking account, our savings account, whatever it is. Or a company puts its money in to get a checking account and so on. That's one way they get money, deposits. And you know what they pay you for your deposit. Right, good, you understand. Nothing, or next to nothing. Then the law says, because they have proven themselves so incompetent and so dangerous, the banks, that there are laws now that say you can't lend out all the money you get. Because if you do, you might not be in a position when people want their money back that they've deposited, you might not have it because you lent it to the wrong people. So there's a law. And the law says, roughly these days, you must keep 20 cents out of every dollar that's deposited with you. It's called your reserve requirements. It's imposed in this country. The bank has to keep 20 cents out of every dollar deposited. But the other 80 cents it can lend. And it gets to keep whatever it gets from lending your money. Okay? That's what a bank is. The second way a bank gets money is by borrowing it. So banks are typically on both sides of the deal. They borrow and they lend. And you can understand, because you need an advanced degree in this complex idea, that if you borrow and you lend, you should lend for a higher rate of interest than you pay when you borrow. Otherwise, you're not going to be making much money, and you won't be there very long. So that's what banks do. They borrow and take deposits, and they lend. And in our society, they're crucial, because every company, every consumer needs to be. I won't bore you or frighten you with the thought, what would happen if you went into a store, used your credit card, and the people laughed at you and handed it back to you? They would be telling you, for example, you don't have credit. And since you only carry $17.14, you've got a problem, because you're not accessing credit. And the problem is for businesses, and the problem is for governments. You're going to see high theater in the next 6 weeks or 10 weeks when the Republicans worry the country about the debt ceiling, allowing the government to borrow still more than it already has, because this is a crucial issue. Okay. So now bailouts. Banks, being the center of the universe and being required to hold reserves, have a problem. On any given day, in any given bank, they do lots of transactions. You've noticed that. You write checks, you use your credit card, you make some deposits. Companies do that. On any given day, at the end of the day, they have to keep track how many dollars came in and how many dollars went out. Now, suppose the dollars that went out were larger than the dollars that came in, which can happen any day, and that means you're down below the 20% you have to keep as your reserve, which could happen to you every day or any day. No problem. Banks in the United States, when they're in that situation, borrow overnight from other banks. The banks that are in a deficit borrow from the banks that have more than they need, the 20%. That's an enormous market. Billions and billions of dollars are lent for one day from one bank to another. Immense transactions. Okay, now the punchline. Suppose something happened that took away the glue that holds all this together. What's the glue? Well, the glue is trust. For a bank to lend money, millions overnight, for example, requires an act of trust. What's the trust? That the bank in the morning will pay us back. Because otherwise, we're dead as a company. We will fall below the reserve, the Federal Reserve will shut us down, our shareholders will fire us. I mean, we can't. Any bank that lends to anybody has trust that it'll come back. Oh, it allows for a few to peter out and not, but you know, they've covered that. But there can't be a general lack of trust, because then, here we go now, then the system would stop. Now, what might happen to destroy trust? If banks got the idea that the other banks that they deal with every day are not, ready, trustworthy, the system would stop. Nobody would lend to anybody in the financial world, and that would mean nobody had the wherewithal to lend to anybody else. What happened is exactly that. In the years leading up to 2007, many banks in the United States got excited about the boom in housing. They made lots of mortgage loans to all kinds of people and companies who they trusted would be able to pay it back. However, because we live in a private enterprise system where everybody does what they can do, we discovered that we had lent money in this country to all kinds of people and businesses who couldn't pay it back. And in 2007, it became clear that there were a large number of them here in the United States. Suddenly, banks became aware that the mortgage they held, mortgage is a debt instrument. A mortgage is a piece of paper you get if you're a bank when you lend Mr. and Mrs. Brown $200,000 to buy a house. They give you a piece of paper which is an IOU. It's called a mortgage. We promise to pay you so much every month for the next 25 years at the end of which we will have bought our house from you, paid off the loan you gave us to buy the house. The banks hold these pieces of paper because they're very valuable. You own that piece of paper, you're the one who gets the monthly payment for 20 years from Mr. and Mrs. Brown. Unless, of course, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, 2 years in, 5 years in, call you up one day and say, you know that monthly payment we've been giving you? You're not getting it anymore because my husband lost his job, because our daughter needs to go to college and we can't afford, whatever. Millions of Americans started doing this in the summer of 2007. And it got more and more as we went into 2008. Suddenly the banks began to realize over a period of weeks and months that they were sitting on large pieces of paper, mortgages, that would never pay back to them. They wouldn't get that money. They wouldn't get the monthly payment, they wouldn't get the interest, and they wouldn't get the principal back on the loan. If they forced it, those people, Mr. and Mrs. Brown, would leave the house, leaving this empty house to the bank. That's all the bank could do, repossess the house. And then the bank would be sitting on a house whose value was collapsing because there were thousands of other houses in that neighborhood just like that, making them worthless or near worthless. Banks suddenly knew that they were sitting on an economic nightmare. They didn't have the money. They had made all these loans. They had taken, just to make it personal, they had taken all your deposits, lent them to people who couldn't pay them back. So that if you arrived and said, you know that $3,000 deposit I put in my account here at the Happy Doodle Bank, I'd like it back. To which the tenor would look at you, smile, and said, we don't like a lot of things, but we're not going to get them. And for example, you're not going to get your $3,000 for a long time, if at all. Have a nice day. So the banks were, in any strict economic sense, bankrupt by the middle of 2008. But here's the consequence of a bank knowing it can't meet its obligations. It can't pay back the loans it took because the people it lent to aren't paying them. It's a chain reaction. It can't cover the deposits. Here's what every bank who experiences this knows. It knows that every other bank is in the exact same situation. So now we come to the evening ledger. We're a little short tonight the way we normally are. We just have to borrow $28 million from another bank. No bank will give it to you. Because every bank knows that tomorrow you may say to them, we had to use that money to cover our depositors. We can't pay. Every bank knew that they themselves weren't trustworthy as a borrower, so they immediately knew nobody else is either. And starting in the summer of 2008, the ability of money to move between banks stopped. The banks couldn't function. They couldn't make any loans to anybody. They didn't trust anybody. Even corporations that weren't banks weren't trusted because those corporations depended on getting back their deposits in the banks, which they couldn't do. So suddenly nobody was lending to anybody. In an economy dependent on debt, it's over. In August and September of 2008, we were this close in this country to an announcement by the banking system that there is no more confidence, no more credit is being provided by anybody to anybody. Nobody trusts anybody. No one can get a loan because no one is confident of giving a loan. And that would have meant that companies couldn't get the loan to meet their payroll. And you would have been called into your company and told, this Friday, when you're supposed to get paid, you won't. Please come in Monday anyway, and we hope next Friday will be different. Your credit card wouldn't work. Nothing. At that point, the United States government and the banks and the leaders of the American industrial system understood that they were this close to a complete meltdown, dysfunction, I mean, trains won't run, subways won't run, nothing. You think Sandy was bad? It's much worse. So something had to be done. The leading bankers went to the government, explained the situation, because the leading bankers understood. They now had to make, let's call it a slight adjustment. Having given speeches for decades about how the private sector is the dynamic, growing, powerful mover of the economy, and it has to get out from under the dead weight of the government, which is a terrible burden. And these people, with those speeches, ran to the only conceivable place that could save them from utter and complete collapse, which turned out to be the government. What they hated and denounced had become, overnight, their savior. The private banking system had collapsed. Nobody held a gun to their head. Nobody required them to make all those loans. No one required them to accept all those deposits. They did all that in the good old profit-driven calculations of capitalists. And here they had the result, a disaster. And the only conceivable way out was to turn to the government. And they begged the government to come in. The government lent them a sympathetic ear. One reason being that the leading bankers and the key government officials are the same people. At that time, for example, Henry Paulson was the head of the Treasury. He was that after leaving his previous job, which was the head of Goldman Sachs Bank. Hello. And that's the norm. That's the norm. They're all like that. It's musical chairs between, so they understand each other, no problem. And so the government stepped in and bailed them out. Now I'm going to tell you what that means. Number one, the government comes in to every bank and says, we understand you can't get a loan from anybody because nobody trusts you. Don't worry. We'll lend you all the money that you can imagine. And you don't have to worry because we, this is the Federal Reserve, we are the ones who print the money. And so we can print, since we have a lot of paper, all the money you want, and we will I'm serious, we will lend it to you. So now, very nice. Next thing the government did, it said that the government would back all of the debts of the major banks. So anybody who had money coming from the bank, don't worry, you can lend to the bank because if they can't pay you back, the government will. And now the best part. The government not only said, we will lend you all the money you need, and we will guarantee all the loans you have taken, but we will also borrow from you all the money you want to lend us. So you don't have, your problems are solved. You can borrow, you can lend. And to make it even better, here's what we'll do. We will lend you unlimited amounts of money at an interest rate that's about 0.5% a year, the Federal Reserve charges. And they turn it around and lend it to the United States Treasury, another branch of the same government, at between 2 and 3%. Let me do that again. The government lends them at 0.5%, borrows from them at 2.3%. You want to know why the banks have come back? Why there's been a recovery? Now you know. Now you know. And it solved the problem. It meant credit moved again. We didn't have to worry that banks didn't trust each other. They didn't have to. Everything was now circulating through the government. Banked by the government, bankrolled by the government, and guaranteed by the government. That's a bailout. That's like the bank coming to you and saying, you know all your financial worries? Relax. We'll give you all the money you need. If you need to make investments to make you feel better, fine, make an investment. Give us some money. We'll pay you more than we charge you for the money we give you. Wonderful. You need advanced degrees in economics to appreciate this. No, you don't. You just know how good it is to have friends in high places. So that's how we got our credit system going. That's how we prevented, and we did, a complete collapse. But make no mistake, the private capitalist banks collapsed. They became complete creatures of the government. In any other society, this would be called what it was: the nationalization and socialization of banking. Banks aren't private anymore. Private banks are collapsed. Banks are agents of the United States government, utterly dependent in every detail on the government, which, by the way, most of them still are. When you hear, "We are proud here at Citibank, we have repaid our loans," that's cute. Loans is only a small part of what you got. The government gave you enormous free credit at a time when no one else on earth would have done that. You're only existing as a bank because the government saved you. The fact that you repay some of these loans is immaterial. If it weren't for the government, you wouldn't be here to pay or not pay. You'd be gone. And you're still dependent in 27 ways on what the government is doing. Many of those guarantees are still in effect and are necessary. 90% of all mortgages written in the United States now are either guaranteed or subsidized by the federal government. Without the government backing up the mortgage industry today, nobody could buy a house. And why is that important to all of you? If there were no buyers, because they couldn't get mortgages, then the value of the house you own would be half of what it is today, because without buyers, the price would have collapsed. So if you're sitting in a comfortable co-op or a condo or a private house, the only reason it's worth what it is today is because the government is gifting you. Tell Mr. Romney he missed that one too. We all, especially the homeowners, which is the upper half of the income distribution, are all dependent on the government, literally for the value of the single most important asset they have, their home. So that's how bailouts work. They do not involve the government so much as the monetary authority. This is mostly an activity by the central bank, is what it's called in other countries. We don't call it a central bank here. We call it the Federal Reserve, but it is the central bank of the United States. They're the ones whose job it is to come in and rescue. Okay? And that's what they did. Notice, there are no conditions on the banks. In other words, you might have expected, in a rational way, that if your private banking system, left in the hands of private capitalists who own the shares, and the boards of directors that they select, who made all the decisions that brought us to the brink of collapse, and that had to be bailed out by the government, you might have imagined that the government said, you know, in exchange for saving you, which we just did, we are going to insist on, I don't know, one person or two on the board of directors of every one of these banks, so that we in the government, since we're the final savior here, that we can make sure you don't do all this stuff again and bring us in. Did the United States demand that? No. It's not that the United States government didn't get it. They didn't ask for it. Did they say, okay, you're going to have to pay us a premium for the next 20 years to make up some of the costs that we had to do this? You know, you have to pay for us bailing you out. Did we do that? No. No. We bailed them out with the same idea that we use to sustain the local public park. It's a good service for us all, so the city will make sure that the grass is cut and the water fountain runs and the tulips are pretty in the spring. But we won't charge you because it's a good for everybody. That's how this government dealt, and most governments have dealt, with the bailout of their banks. It is simply something that ought to be done. Nor should we be surprised, because as I told you, the government officials making that decision were bankers a couple of years ago and will be bankers when they quit their job. Okay? So they understand each other, even if they don't understand much else. Okay, so much for bailouts. Let's now turn to the other part, because that's where the fiscal cliff comes in. The other part of what governments do when a capitalist system falls apart, stops functioning, works its way into a catastrophic dead end. We now turn to the question, what does the main government do? Not the monetary authority, not the central bank, not the Federal Reserve, the government in Washington, the president, the Congress, that part. What do they do? Well, I'm going to take you through the steps so you understand. The first thing that typically happens when an economy begins to have a problem, the way we did in 2007 and 8, and the way the rest of the world did as markets distributed around the world, the catastrophe unfolding in the United States. Just a footnote. I know that many of you have taken courses in economics where you learned about the wonderful way of markets. Markets efficiently allocate things. Markets are a system of signaling to us, gee, you should buy less tomatoes because the price went up, things like that. Markets really convey useful information as a way of distributing goods and services. There's some truth to that. It's just important to remember that markets also convey bad news. When the United States economy collapsed in 2007 and 8, how did the disaster arrive, I don't know, in China, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America? By means of the market. The market was a mechanism to move toxicity from wherever it started to everywhere else. So if you like markets when they work well, you got to live with it when they don't. When what they distribute to the rest of the world is a disaster. Okay? Anyway, what do governments do? And it's very interesting. They typically begin, and I use as an example the United States in 2007, which is when the government became aware that our economy was heading down. The beginning is a policy which really deserves the name do nothing. It's very important. Do nothing. If you look at what George Bush, who was president at that time, what his government did in 2007 and the first half of 2008, it could be described as nothing. He made speeches, this is just a problem of subprime mortgages, or we have nothing to worry about. That was his job. Babble, not do anything. Here's how this works. People are losing their jobs. Businesses are collapsing, going bankrupt, or shrinking because people haven't got the money to buy things, partly because they're unemployed. And when some people are unemployed and they can't buy things from the store lays off some of its people who are now additional unemployed, and they can't go bowling, so the bowling alley lays off the person who hands you the smelly shoes, and all of that. Okay? All of that. So the government does nothing. Why is that a policy? Because it is the hope of the capitalist system and of its operators that when these downturns happen, they're a little bit like inappropriate behavior by a dinner guest. When the dinner guest you have over begins to say things that are not appropriate, you know, the kind of jokes that you shouldn't say, the first thing everybody does is look around, stare at the wall, discuss the flowers, and hope this person gets over whatever it is ailing him or her. You do nothing and hope that it will solve the problem. That's what we do in capitalism, uniformly. Bush was in no way, you do nothing. Here's what you're hoping for in economics. You're hoping that as unemployment grows, the economy turns down, as businesses cut back, they will do and experience the following. Workers who are unemployed will become desperate. They use up their savings. They're becoming a burden on their spouse and their children and their neighbors and their friends. So they'll be willing, here we go, to take a job at less money than they used to get because that's better than no job at all. Likewise, the companies that are cutting back, you know, they have now more computers than they need. So they unload the computers on the secondary market. And they get rid of their fleets of vehicles if they have them. And they use up less space in the shopping mall for their store. And they cut their retainer deal with their lawyer because they don't need him so much. All the other costs of business go down as people unload them. And the idea is eventually, as wages come down and the costs of doing business go down, all the input costs, eventually, capitalists will say, hey, at these lower wages and at these lower prices, I can make money, and the economy will come out of the downturn and become an upturn. So doing nothing means you don't have any kind of problem. You don't have to admit the system is messed up. You don't have to go to the government and ask for help. You get through it. Just like at the dinner party, you get through the off-color jokes that Mrs. Mahoney wasn't supposed to make, but did anyway, okay? This is fine. This is the way the hope is. And by the way, there are downturns in capitalism that are shallow enough and short enough that it works. The do-nothing approach works. So that's why capitalists always hope it will. Just like at every dinner party, you hope, by pretending that you didn't hear what you just heard, it'll maybe not be repeated. Okay? But of course, there are many examples, and we're in one now, where it wasn't enough, where the unemployment kept on getting worse, and the business cutbacks kept on getting worse. Now what do? What happens now? Now you begin to have a problem. And the government is getting frightened. It doesn't know quite what to do. At that point, for the first time, a critical perspective becomes acceptable. It's the perspective we now call Keynesian economics. It's what you can read, as I've told you before, in Paul Krugman's columns in the New York Times twice a week, or however often he does it. But he says that the same thing over and over, and so you can get, he's teaching us, the readers, Keynesian economics. And what's the idea? Okay, here's the idea. The government has to step in and save us. It's the same idea you saw before in terms of the money system, bailing us out. The government is going to save us. The government has to do something. And we want the government to come in, and here's the words that use in America, to provide a stimulus. A stimulus. What does that mean? That the government is going to come in and boost up the demand for goods and services so that more and more goods and services are purchased, leading the people who produce them to hire more and more people to make those goods and services. Those people get an income, and so they'll buy more goods and services, and the economy will be back. So how does the government get that to happen? Two things. It cuts taxes so that people have more money to spend. And number two, the government itself spends money like crazy. In 2009, Obama gave a stimulus of $800 billion, a big lot of money. About half of it went to cities and states, so they wouldn't lay off as many people as they were laying off, because they wouldn't get any taxes either. And the rest was all those signs you see on highways. And we're rebuilding the highway, or we're improving the protection against storms. Anyway, that was what was said, and that was what was done. But here's a problem, right? If the government is going to come in and save capitalism from itself again, not with money this time, but with stimulus and tax cuts, you all know, without a PhD in economics, that if the federal government cuts taxes to stimulate spending and spends more money itself, we got a problem. The government is taking in less, that's what a tax cut means, and the government is spending more. Well, how the hell can the government take in less and spend more? It has to borrow the money. It has to borrow the money. And so it has to go to whoever it is that normally lends money to the government, which is, of course, the banks and the big corporations and wealthy people. If none of you have ever lent money to the government, it means you're not wealthy, which may come as a shock to you, but your neighbors already knew. Okay? So this is a game rich people play. So the government has to borrow in order to be able to stimulate. But now we reach another problem. Isn't it sad in capitalism? No sooner do you solve a problem than it creates yet another problem. So capitalism is going to solve the problem by having the government come in and save it by stimulating, cutting taxes and spending. But in order to do so, it has to borrow, which means it has to persuade lenders to give it money, to lend it money. Now, some countries could do that. The United States was able to do it. The United States has been borrowing more than $1 trillion, sometimes as much as $1.5 trillion over recent years to do this. That's an awful lot of money. No problem. Everywhere in the world, people are willing, indeed eager, to lend to the United States government. Even though the interest the United States government pays is crap, 2%, 3%, it's horrible. Why is that? Well, It's important to understand this because it tells you a lot about the world economy today. Everywhere in the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, wherever, everyone who's got any sense about economics is looking around and going, oh my God, does the world economy look bad? I dare not invest. It's too risky. I'm not going to produce more of something. I can't even sell what we're already producing. I'm not going to invest here. I'm not going to invest. The world is, the only place that seems to be bubbling along is China, and they don't want me to invest there. So I'm not gonna. So what am I going to do with my money? I know. I'll lend it to the United States government. It's virtually no risk. It's the most secure, most powerful government in the world, and I'll only make 2 or 3%. But that's a safer investment in a rough economic time. So the world's wealthy have been pouring money into the United States, allowing the United States to borrow wild amounts of money and falling, of course, deeper and deeper in debt. We are the world's #1 debtor country. No other country on the planet owes as much to the rest of the world as we do as a nation. We are having a wonderful time sucking in the money of the rest of the world, or to be more accurate, of the rich people in the rest of the world. Another sign of the same thing is that the rich people in the rest of the world are smart, and they know that if the economy is as crappy as it has been for 5 years and looks to be for the next, it's not safe to keep all your money where you are. You don't want all your wealth to be in Manila, or in New Delhi, or in Honolulu, or in, no, bad example, Sao Paulo, anywhere in the world. Wealthy people are realizing that in a time of economic trouble in the world, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversify your holdings. Move your wealth. And where do you want to move it? Here, the safest place in world capitalism. You don't want to move it to Paris. They just have a socialist government in power. You don't know about London. Their system is falling apart, which it truly is. And Japan is sitting at the end of a 25-year depression and still no way out. So America is where you want to put it. And you'll put money in a bank account. But there's another thing which you in New York should appreciate, that many wealthy people decide another way to hold your wealth is to own an apartment or 2 or 9 or a whole building here in Williamsburg or the Lower East Side or wherever. That's a good thing. That's what makes apartments as expensive as they are, buildings as expensive as they are. Even though the world economy is in trouble, New York, like certain other world capitals, is a place where the wealthy of the world want to own some property. It's safe. So the United States has been able to borrow. But now let's look at another country, Greece. Greece is not like the United States, without meaning any disrespect to Greek people, but the world's wealthy don't want to put their money in Athens. That's not smart. We don't even know what Athens will look like in a few years, and it is looking bad these days. So nobody wants to lend money to the Greeks. So when the Greeks arrive, saying, okay, we know what we have to do to overcome the crisis. We're going to cut taxes, and we're going to spend a lot of money, and we're going to borrow the money, and nobody will lend to us. So we can't. The lenders to Greece said to them 3 years ago, okay, you want to have a stimulus the way Americans did it, and the Chinese did, and so on? Fine, we will lend you the money. But not at the 3 and 4 and 4.5% we used to. How about, 15%? Well, the Greeks said, are you kidding? If we had to pay you that much, it'll make our deficit even worse. We will have to pay all that money. We can't. Fine, said the lenders. Have a nice day. But then they were finished. They couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. They couldn't borrow the money, so they couldn't stimulate their economy. So the unemployment got worse, and the business collapse got worse. And young people in Greece started leaving Greece to look for jobs and lives elsewhere, as has happened to that country many times over the last couple of centuries. And a sign of real social crisis, far beyond economic crisis. So the Greeks were desperate. And the Greeks came up with a plan how to get loans. They went to the Europeans and said, the private lenders, the banks, won't lend to us. Just a footnote. The banks who wouldn't lend to Greece anymore, except if they charged an awful lot, were what banks? They were the Greek banks who lent to the Greek government, and the French and the German banks. They were the major lenders. Now let's follow the ball. These were the banks who were telling the Greeks they wouldn't lend to them because they weren't trustworthy. These are the same banks who had just been bailed out by their governments because they were defunct. Ooh. Bailed out by their governments. Now they wouldn't lend to the Greeks. So the Greeks were desperate. And they went to the European government, the European Commission, the European Union, the European Central Bank, that's the European equivalent of the Federal Reserve, and the International Monetary Fund, and they came up with a plan to save Greece. You, the governmental agencies, the international, you lend us money here in Greece at 3 or 4%. And we'll use it to pay off our debts to those private banks, so we get rid of them. And what we're doing there is called the socialization of debt. The Greeks are becoming indebted not to private bankers. Those all get paid off. They don't suffer at all. Instead, the Greeks get the money from all of the people of Europe through their governments. Now this, of course, freaks out the people of Europe because they realize Greece is a tiny country and they're spending $250 billion. It's a lot of money. What in the world will happen when Portugal and Spain and Italy and all the other countries, much, much bigger than Greece, when they go? Then all of the money of Europe will be poured down the drain. Ah, poor Mrs. Merkel, Mr. Sarkozy in France, they face a terrible problem. They're going to have to fund the people of this, and their own people will have to suffer because money that can't be used for German swimming pools will now be used to bail out the Portuguese government. This is a political death warrant for Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Sarkozy. How do they handle that they have to help Greece? Why? And I'm sorry about the complications here, but you'll see the logic. Why didn't the Germans and the French say to the Greeks, you stink. You're just Greek, and we're going to let you go. Because if they didn't bail out Greece, Greece couldn't pay back the loans to the French and German banks, who would thereupon collapse again, because they had already collapsed in 2008 and 9. Now they would collapse again in 2009 and 10. And when they collapsed, they would have gone to the German and French government to be bailed out. They could barely put that by their working classes the first time. They cannot do it twice. End of Mr. Sarkozy's career. He, by the way, was bounced out even without having to do that. And Mrs. Merkel understands. She has to give the Greeks the money. The Greeks have her politically. So they gave the Greeks the money and they paid off the German banks. This was a way of the German government paying off, bailing out its own banks a second time without appearing to do so. And to make the theater complete, we are going to punish you Greek people for having given you this loan. What? Yes, you are, get ready now because it's right back to the beginning of today. You are lazy, good for nothing, mañana people. You are forever eating anchovies and lemons and funny things like that, which real people in the middle of Europe don't touch. You don't work very hard. You take vacations for 27 weeks of the year. You retire at the advanced age of 41, etc., etc., etc. And we, the hardworking German and French people, are not going to be dragged down by giving you all a lifetime of holidays. Sound familiar? Echo of Mr. Romney, or to be more accurate, Mr. Romney echoing that. Yeah, same bit. Only the dangers in Europe are even greater than here. Standard joke all over Southern Europe. The capitalist crisis enables the Germans to become the dominating power of Europe, what Hitler couldn't do with the military, Merkel does with financial documents. That's not a sign of European union. That's a sign of European catastrophe building. So these are extremely dangerous. But here in the United States, let's finish. We can borrow money. So there is a Keynesian stimulus. Obama gets it through, and he's continuing to do it. Those of you who pay attention know that over the last year or two, we've had a cut in the withholding for Social Security. What is taken out of your check, if you had that taken out of your check, is less because it was artificially reduced. That's a tax cut. That leaves more money in your hands, the hope being you will buy more things and will get that result. So we did some Keynesian economics. Did it solve our crisis? No. Are we back to the unemployment we had at the beginning of this crisis, 5%? Not at all. We're at 7.8%, not even close. So what the Keynesians are saying, and again, read Mr. Krugman and you'll see it, is, oh my God, we have to have a bigger stimulus. And don't worry about borrowing money. We're not having any problem. The rest of the world is willing to lend us. And look, even though our debts go up, and that is a problem, it's not half the problem if we don't solve our economic difficulties. So let's get our economy growing again, and then use the growth to pay down the debt once we've got growth. So borrow away, since we can. We're not Greeks. We can. And that would have been the solution, except we're not doing that. We're not doing anything like, we're doing the opposite. That's the mystery. At the end of this month, if Mr. Obama and Mr. Boehmer cannot, how do you pronounce his name? And I hope you all understand why he needs it to be pronounced that way. And if you don't, ask a younger person, they will explain it to you. Okay, so Mr. Boehner with an O, Mr. Boehner with an O, has to debate with Mr. Obama, and they have to come to a resolution about what? About something that they both believe in and that the government passed a year ago. And what is it that they believe in? And what is it they're going to do? Because they're only dickering over the details. What are they going to do? They're going to do something which is the opposite of a Keynesian stimulus. They're going to raise taxes, which means we have less money to spend, and they're going to cut government spending, which means less spending. It's the opposite. It's what in every other country, not here, is called austerity. You're making life harder for people. You're raising their taxes, and you're cutting the government spending. Why would they do that if what we had before was do-nothingism, didn't work? We've had now some Keynesian economics, helped a little but not enough. The solution is to go back and do worse than do nothing, actually suppress the economy by austerity, by raising taxes. And why would you do that? Why is Obama agreed? If you look at the plan, Obama is in favor of raising taxes and cutting spending. He would like to raise taxes more than he cuts spending. And the Republicans would like to raise taxes less and cut spending more. But notice, they're only disagreeing about the proportions. They're all doing the opposite of a stimulus. When every economist in the United States will tell you that is going to make us go back into a recession. Why would they do this? And the answer, and then we're finished. The answer is back to what I said to you before when I told you about the government program to do nothing. By clenching down on the economy, unemployment will get worse, more businesses will have problems, the wages will go down, and the costs of all the other inputs will be depressed, and we're back to waiting for the capitalists to see enough money in it to invest again and to bring the economy back. What is the answer to this plan? Well, you know what it is in Europe, where they've been doing exactly this. It's the biggest coordinated demonstrations that Europe has seen in half a century in every country without exception. And in some countries, massive general strikes. Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and many others. On the 14th of November, a coordinated demonstration and strikes across all Europe, something which the left and the unions in Europe haven't been able to do for, as I say, 50 years. So you're seeing that the answer of the mass of people is, as it always is. We really do somewhere understand. You're waiting us out. You're waiting to see how long we will have how many people unemployed, eating up all of our savings, straining our marriages and our family life and our home life, losing us the skills we had accumulated in the jobs we lost, blah, 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 blah. You're waiting to see whether we permit you to get out of this capitalist crisis on our backs. Last point. And the irony of this, if you get this, will be, for me, a successful evening. In the 1930s in the United States, the mass of the people said, after several years, that's it. No more austerity. No more of this stuff with we have to be unemployed, we have to take all the difficulty while we wait until our wages are depressed and everything. And so you had the uprising of the CIO. More people joined unions in the 1930s than had ever done so in American history before or since. As you know, I've told you about this before, those of you that have come other times. We had powerful socialist parties, several of them. We had a powerful communist party, and they all worked together with the CIO on the union drives. Tens of millions of Americans were caught up in a union, socialist, communist movement who went to Roosevelt and said, we're not waiting anymore. And Roosevelt was a smart enough politician to say, okay, I got it. He knew that they were desperate. He knew that they were angry. And because they had lots of socialists and communists, he was hearing them say, you know, if you don't take care of us, there ain't going to be any capitalism here because we're the enemies of capitalism. He got that. And he went to the other rich corporations and he said to them, we better do something to help the mass of Americans. No more austerity. We got to spend money like there's no tomorrow helping people, or else we're history, we're gone. And remember, there's the Soviet Union in Russia at that time, so there's an example of where it can go. Plus those communists in the Communist Party were celebrating Russia all the time in the demonstrations, so in case anyone didn't get the idea, they made sure. So Roosevelt convinced about half of the rich, no more austerity. Forget this raising taxes and cutting spending. On the contrary, he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend money like that. You want to see stimulus? Here we go. Number one, Social Security. Everybody who's 65 years of age or older, we're going to give you money every week forever. Unemployment compensation. We never had that before, just like we never had Social Security before. You're unemployed, and there were tens of millions of people unemployed then. We're going to give you a check every week for a year or two. And finally, we're going to take 12 million of you, 12 million Americans, and give them a job working for the federal government with an income. Unbelievable spending. And where would the money come from? The money, there's no money. How could you possibly do that? One of the justifications these days of cutting Social Security, of cutting welfare, of cutting Medicaid. Today. Okay, but is it relevant? Is it relevant for anything? Ah, one of these, okay. Sorry.
You missed me.
Okay, yeah. So Roosevelt had to find the money. And he went to the rich and the corporations, and he said, of course I know where the money is, just like all of you know where the money is, to do it now. You all have the money. The rich people have the money. The corporations have the money. And you, he said to them, you're going to pay for Social Security, unemployment compensation, and hiring millions of people. And you're going to pay because it's the best option you got. Because if you don't, you won't have any money at all. So give me half of what you got and be glad you got the other half. And they did. The only reason we're discussing a fiscal cliff, a cliff that this society is ready to go over, the only reason we allow the two political parties to debate whether they're going to cut more taxes or cut the spending or what combination, when what we need in the economy is the opposite, is because there is no movement from below that threatens. We have an American population that sits and suffers and worries and is upset, but it is not yet ready to deal with it. And even if it were, here's the irony. What saved American capitalism in the 1930s was the left. What got them through the Great Depression was the demand from below that made them realize, yeah, spend a lot of money, borrow until there's no tomorrow, and get us out of this. And the growth that will happen afterwards will pay for it. That's pretty much how it worked out. But they wouldn't have done it then, just like they're not doing it now. And the irony is the left that forced the issue in the 1930s. The unions, the socialists, and the communists. As soon as the Depression was over and the war was over, what did the business community and the rich, who were bitter that they had had to pay for that? They understood the argument, but they wanted to get back to where things were. And they knew that what had created the force that made it impossible to use austerity in the 30s after 1933, that made them move to a stimulus. The force that did that had to be destroyed. So first they got rid of the communists, then they got rid of the socialists, and now they are quite finished with destroying the labor movement. It worked. There is no socialism, communism, labor movement today. It can't force the Keynesian solution. And here's the irony. The capitalists who got rid of their enemies, in the process got rid of their own saviors. That's the irony. They don't understand it, they can't see through it, and they're going to be stuck with it. But however the outcome, this combination of government spending, austerity, whatever the outcome, notice one final thing. All these policies, what the Federal Reserve does with monetary bailouts, what the austerity might do with cutting back on government spending and raising taxes, or what even the Keynesians, if they get back into power, would do, cut taxes and raise spending. All of those things leave untouched and unquestioned the capitalist organization of enterprises. We're leaving in power the shareholders who own those companies. We leave in their hands the choice and selection of the boards of directors of all those companies, the banks, the auto companies, all of them. We leave in place the network of rewards and punishments that shape their decisions and their behavior. We're doing nothing about the basic structure that got us into this problem. And we therefore condemn ourselves to it again and again. We didn't learn the lesson of the 1930s. We taxed them to make a stimulus. We regulated them. And they remained in power. And they used their power and they used their wealth, the boards of directors, the major shareholders, to undo everything that was done in the 30s to get us right back into the next depression. And if all the left or the critical thinking people in America can do today is come up with another set of regulations, another set of rules and punishments, then we haven't learned anything. We're leaving in place the basic structure of enterprises. Means we're condemning ourselves to the next cycle of capitalist instability. You really have to scratch your head and say, when will people say enough? In Greece, the country that has been pushed the furthest, The party that now comes in #1 in all polling is called the Syriza Political Party. It got as little as 3 and 4% up until last year. It is a party that opposes not only austerity across the board, but one of its central slogans is that Greece can do better than capitalism. And the two major parties of Greece that shared power back and forth every few years, exactly like the Republicans and Democrats do here. One is called the New Democracy Party, the other one is called the Greek Socialist Party, PASOK. Together they would get 2/3 or more of the vote, year after year after year. There have been 2 national elections in Greece this year, as Greece falls apart. And the 2 parties that always got 2/3 of the vote now only get 1/3 of the vote. 2/3 of the Greek people voted for neither of the 2 classic parties. Democrats and Republicans, are you listening? You ought to, because we're headed in a direction that is in every way parallel to what has happened there. And the fiscal cliff, no matter what the deal is another step in an austerity scenario. And to think that it would produce violent revolt in Europe and have no effect here is to make the same mistake people made before suddenly Occupy became everybody's watchword. It's happening here too. The form is just a little different, and the timing is a little later. But often what comes later is much harsher than what could have been accomplished earlier. Thank you very much. I've used up my time.